The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a rhythm that never changed, the same steady drone that had filled operating theaters in Baghdad, and Rachel Torres moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU corridor with the careful invisibility of someone trained to disappear. Her temp nurse credentials were legitimate, 2 weeks of work at Norfolk's busiest military hospital, the kind of assignment nobody questioned, but the 17-year-old scar tissue mapping her right shoulder under her scrubs told a different story. She wore it without flinching. She wore all of them without flinching. The hospital smelled like stale coffee and antiseptic, the same combination that had marked every shift since she'd been ordered to vanish. That was the word they used, ordered. A classified operation in Baghdad that had gone so wrong it had to be unmade, and the military had chosen to unmake her along with it. Official records deleted. Service records sealed. A senior chief petty officer erased from every database that mattered, left to move through civilian hospitals under borrowed names and emergency staffing contracts. They had told her never to surface, never to speak, never to let anyone connect the face to the rank. The alternative was federal prison, they'd explained with bureaucratic precision. Security clearance violations. Unauthorized disclosure. The details were intentionally vague. She checked the med cart on the 3rd floor, her movements economical and practiced. 7 years of field trauma medicine under fire had taught her to work without wasting motion. Every gesture served a purpose. Every step counted. The other nurses, the permanent staff, didn't quite know what to make of her. She was competent enough that they couldn't dismiss her, but quiet enough that they could forget she was there. That was how she preferred it. Invisibility was safety. Invisibility kept her alive. Room 347 was at the end of the corridor, past the station where 3 nurses were passing chart notes and a monitor was beeping its mechanical heartbeat into the afternoon. Rachel pushed the door open with her shoulder, the way people did when their hands were full, though her hands were empty. Habit. Everything about her was habit now, the careful choices, the measured words, the practiced erasure of 17 years from her face and voice. The colonel lay in the bed with the peculiar stillness of someone whose brain wasn't quite firing on all cylinders anymore. Traumatic brain injury, the chart said. IED blast, 2006. The kind of wound that could steal everything a person was and leave the body behind like an empty house. His right forearm was visible above the cotton blanket, muscled and weathered, and there on the inside of his wrist was a tattoo in faded black ink, the callsign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 15 years. Ghostbird. The name she'd shed like a skin, left behind in the sand and the smoke and the chaos of a firefight that had lasted 43 minutes and changed everything that mattered. She stared at it for 3 seconds. No longer. Just long enough to feel the weight of it settle in her chest, somewhere behind where the scar tissue was thickest. She didn't flinch. She didn't let her breath change. She turned to check his for line with the same mechanical competence she would have used for any patient, her hand steady as they'd always been, her mind already running the differential on his current medications. 2 antibiotics. A proton pump inhibitor. Lorazepam for anxiety. Morphine for pain. The list was thorough enough, but she caught something that made her pause. A medication dosage that seemed off by decimal points. The kind of thing nobody else would notice. The kind of thing that added up to billing codes that didn't match the actual treatment provided. She made a note in her phone, small, invisible, and moved on to the next room. Behind her, the colonel lay in the bed with a woman's name tattooed on his arm in ink he probably didn't remember getting, his mind too far away to recognize the person it had belonged to even if she'd worn her rank on her chest like other nurses wore their credentials. The break room was empty when she arrived at 15:13, the afternoon shift not yet assembled. She sat with her coffee, black, no sugar, never sugar, and opened her phone to verify the medication order discrepancy. Dr. Hargrove. Of course it was Hargrove. The name had already appeared on 7 charts she'd reviewed, each one with similar minor adjustments that accumulated into significant billing variations. Nothing that would trigger an automatic system alert. Nothing obvious enough to catch the eye of someone not trained to spot field expedient fraud. She was writing out the details when the break room door opened and Dr. Nathan Hargrove stepped through, all confidence and expensive cologne. He was tall, the kind of tall that came with privilege, a man who'd never had to make himself smaller to survive. His scrubs were pristine despite being mid-shift, and his stethoscope hung around his neck like the symbol of authority it was meant to be. He stopped when he saw her. Not because she was there. Because she was looking at her phone with the expression of someone who had found a problem. "You're the temp." It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement a man made when he was establishing hierarchy. Rachel Torres. She didn't elaborate. She didn't offer her hand. She simply acknowledged the fact of her existence in his space. "How long has Oak Creek needed fill-in staff?" His voice was light, conversational, the kind of tone men used when they were deciding whether you were a threat. 2 weeks. End of month. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that said he'd already decided something about her, some calculus that involved her temporary status and her lack of institutional power and whatever he was protecting in those medication orders. "I'll make sure administration knows you're doing adequate work. Don't want you getting any ideas about applying for permanent position. We prefer stability in the ICU. Established relationships. You understand." It wasn't a threat. Not technically. But it was close enough that she registered it in the same part of her brain that registered weapons systems and hostile movement. She looked up from her phone with the measured composure that came from having survived things that killed most people. "I only verify what's on the chart." Of course. He was already moving toward the refrigerator, the conversation over from his perspective. No one's asking you to do anything more than your job. But he had seen her looking. And he had made a calculation. And somewhere in the institutional structure of Oak Creek Memorial, forces were already beginning to align against the temp nurse who checked medication orders and noticed things that didn't match up. She finished her coffee without tasting it and returned to the ICU, where the colonel lay with Ghostbird written in permanent ink on his skin, a name that belonged to a woman who no longer technically existed, a name he would never remember giving, and a bond that had been forged in fire 15 years ago in a place that was no longer on any map she was allowed to carry. The fluorescent lights hummed their unchanging rhythm overhead, and Rachel Torres moved through the corridor with her practiced invisibility, not knowing that the moment she had opened her phone to verify a single medication order, she had crossed a line that Dr. Hargrove had no intention of allowing her to cross. Room 347 smelled like antiseptic and dying hope. Rachel Torres moved through the doorway with the careful efficiency of someone trained to be invisible, her temp badge clipped to pale blue scrubs that hung loose on a frame built for different work. The colonel lay in the center of the bed, tubes running from his arms like vines on a trellis, his chest rising and falling in the mechanical rhythm of a man whose body had forgotten how to breathe on its own. His daughter stood at the bedside. His wife at the foot. A grandson pressed against the window, watching the Norfolk rain streak the glass. They looked at Rachel the way most families did, as if she were furniture, necessary but unworthy of attention. That invisibility was the point. That invisibility kept her alive. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 6:38 a.m. like a storm front, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, his presence making the air pressure change in the room. He didn't acknowledge Rachel's dressing change or the fact that she'd already assessed the surgical site, documented the wound depth, and noted the slight heat indicating early infection. He simply stood in the doorway and watched her work with the intensity of a man calculating odds. Rachel taped the final sterile dressing. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, because she had. Combat triage in Baghdad. Field medicine in the dark. Wounds that would have sent civilians into shock. A single piece of gauze. Pressure. Movement to the next patient. "Miss Torres." Hargrove's voice cut through the room like a scalpel through skin. "Perhaps you could explain your charting from the 0200 shift." She didn't turn. "The vital signs are documented. Chest tube output is clear." "That's not what I'm asking." He stepped closer, and the family felt the shift in temperature, the sudden drop in oxygen that came when a predator entered a space. "I'm asking how someone with your basic competency manages not to confuse milligrams with milliliters. It's almost alarming." Almost negligent. The colonel's wife tensed. The daughter's hand moved to her father's arm. Rachel stood. She turned to face him with the kind of stillness that comes from having survived worse than words. She did not blush. She did not retreat. She met his eyes and breathed in for 4 counts, held for 4, released for 4, a rhythm taught to her 17 years ago at BUD-SES when everything was pain and nothing was mercy. The charting is accurate, doctor. Her voice sat somewhere between steel and silk. The medication orders are verified. If there's a concern, I'd appreciate specifics. Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd never been told no and had no framework for understanding it. Your background is sparse, isn't it? Where exactly did you train, Miss Torres? Your resume lists a gap. Quite a substantial one. From 2003 to 2018. 15 years. You simply disappeared. The room held its breath. The family watched this exchange like tennis, their heads moving in sync. Rachel didn't blink. I was working overseas. Overseas? He repeated the word as if it was a lie she'd already told him. Where exactly? Where the work was needed. He laughed then, a sound like breaking glass, and turned to the colonel's daughter. Your father's care is going to require consistency. Continuity. I'm concerned about the quality of attention he's receiving from temporary staff with questionable backgrounds. But don't worry. I have 3 specialists coming in this afternoon. Some of my best physicians. We'll make sure he gets appropriate care. He left the room, and the silence that followed was the kind that happens after a punch lands, that second before pain registers. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial existed in the basement, a fluorescent-lit purgatory with a refrigerator that hummed and a coffee maker that was always 2 hours from producing anything drinkable. It was 11:22 a.m. when Rachel stepped inside, still wearing her scrubs, still carrying the weight of the morning like a stone in her chest. 3 nurses sat at the small table. They saw her and something shifted, a collective inhale, a subtle movement away. One of them, Martinez, who'd been kind yesterday, stood up and left without finishing her coffee. Rachel poured water from the tap. She didn't look at them. She knew what was happening. Hargrove was a man who understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He'd made a single phone call or planted a single seed, and now the machinery was working. His brother's a lawyer, you know, Chen said to no one in particular. Hargrove. Very connected. I heard that too, the 3rd nurse replied. My cousin works in administration. She said Hargrove got 2 staff reviews initiated this month. Both for documentation issues. They were speaking around Rachel, the way people spoke about the invisible. Their words were meant for each other but shaped for her ears. This was the poison Hargrove had injected, not direct, not confrontational. Just a slow-spreading doubt. Rachel sat down at the table. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Just sat, as if she belonged there, as if she had a right to oxygen in this room. Both nurses stood up within 7 seconds. They left their badges, their coffee mugs, their dignity, and walked through the door without making eye contact. The unit board on the 2nd floor was impossible to miss. Posted at 1406, printed on official letterhead, signed by Dr. Hargrove in that careful handwriting of men who document their cruelty. Documentation deficiencies, Rachel Torres, contract employee. Per hospital policy, this letter documents a pattern of charting inconsistencies noted during review of recent shifts, including incomplete medication reconciliation, 0200 shift, 1108, vital sign documentation gaps, 0430 shift, 1109, and questionable nursing judgment during patient assessments. Continued employment contingent upon immediate improvement in documentation standards and competency demonstration. No further errors will be tolerated. Rachel read it standing in the hallway. She read it 3 times. Not because she didn't understand, she understood perfectly. Because understanding and accepting were 2 different things, and she was still learning the difference between the 2. The tears came without warning. Just one, sliding down her left cheek before she even knew it was there. She wiped it without looking away from the board, without breaking her posture, without allowing anyone to see anything but a woman reading a notice about her own failure. A nurse walked past, noticed the moisture on her face, and looked away quickly. Pity was dangerous. Pity was a door that should never open. Rachel turned from the board and walked toward the back stairwell. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was measured. Everything about her was controlled except for that single tear, which she'd wiped away before it finished falling. She found Hargrove in his office at 15:38. His door was open, which meant he wanted to be found. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. "Doctor." He looked up from his desk with the expression of someone expecting an apology, expecting tears, expecting a woman to crumble under the weight of institutional pressure. "I read the write-up." "Yes, well." The medication reconciliation was verified. The vital sign documentation matches the monitor strips. The charting is accurate. Hargrove stood. His hands pressed against his desktop, and she watched them as if they were weapons, because everything about him was a weapon. "You're questioning my assessment." Rachel didn't move. She stood in the center of his office with the kind of calm that comes from having already lost everything and survived it. "I'm stating facts. The documentation is accurate. The medication orders are correct. The patient assessments are thorough. Your background is suspicious. Your references are limited. Your presence here is making people uncomfortable. I've been on this unit for 8 days. In that time, I've caught 3 medication errors, identified a post-op infection that the day shift missed, and prevented a patient fall by moving faster than everyone else. Those are facts you can verify." Hargrove's face darkened. This wasn't how it went. People cried. People defended themselves through emotion. People begged for second chances. Rachel stood there like she was testifying in a courtroom, like every word was evidence. "I know what you are," he said quietly. Rachel felt something ancient stir in her chest. A recognition. A warning. But when she spoke, her voice remained level. "I know what you are, too, Doctor. I've seen men with more integrity bleed out in the sand." She didn't wait for his response. She turned and left his office, and she could feel his rage radiating behind her like heat from an overheated engine, the fury of a man accustomed to dominance discovering that not everyone could be broken. The shift ended at 7 p.m. Rachel's locker in the nurse's changing room held her personal items, a jacket, her phone, a photo of 6 SEALs in a Kandahar compound taken 18 years ago, when half of them were still alive. She opened it and stared at the image without touching it. The break room was empty. The hallways were quiet. The night shift was just beginning their rounds, and Rachel Torres was already erasing herself from the building's institutional memory. She didn't know that at 23:51, someone, perhaps Chen, perhaps Martinez, would notice the write-up had been amended. Hargrove's documentation would later be reviewed as part of a larger investigation. She didn't know that the patient in room 347, the Air Force colonel whose callsign she'd once been, would survive the next 72 hours. She didn't know that muscle memory would override institutional cowardice at 2:06 a.m. when 5 trained physicians stepped back from a dying man. All she knew was the rain. All she knew was the weight of the cardboard box in her hands. All she knew was that somewhere in Baghdad, 15 years ago, a colonel had taken a needle and thread and stitched her call sign inside his jacket lining, Ghostbird, and carried that evidence against the day when the world finally had to remember she was real. The bus stop on Waterside Drive was metal and plastic and inadequate. Rachel stood beneath it, rain hammering down like applause for her own erasure. The box contained the things temporary people carried, a mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent named Thaddeus that she'd rescued from the hospital break room trash, and a photograph of 6 ghosts in desert camouflage. She was thinking about taking the next bus anywhere when her phone rang. The phone rang at 2:13 a.m. Not a hospital phone. Her personal phone. The one with the number she'd given to exactly nobody. Rachel stared at the screen in the rain outside the bus stop on Harborview Drive. Unknown caller. She answered anyway because people who'd survived Baghdad didn't ignore unknown numbers at 2 in the morning. Senior Chief Torres. Male voice. Clipped. Military bearing even through the phone line. This is Captain Mitchell, Naval Hospital Corpsmen Association. We need you back at Oak Creek. Now. She almost hung up. Almost. The colonel in 347. His name is James Whitmore. You know him. The rain changed sound. Harder. Like it was hammering glass instead of asphalt. Rachel's hand tightened on the phone. She knew that name the way a sniper knows a target they've carried for 15 years. Colonel James Whitmore. The man she'd dragged 3 blocks through sniper fire in Fallujah while his brain was leaking into her hands. The man she'd thought about every time she closed her eyes since 2009. What's wrong with him? Her voice came out flat. Professional. The voice of someone who'd been trained to compartmentalize. Tension pneumothorax. Deteriorating fast. The doctors are freezing. You need to move. She was moving before he finished the sentence. The cardboard box dropped into a trash bin. The bus never came. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial had the particular quality of silence that comes right before everything breaks. Rachel slipped past the security desk at 2:28 a.m. wearing a surgical cap pulled low, borrowed scrubs from the linen room, and the kind of invisible confidence that comes from having done this exact thing in compounds where the walls were sandbags. Room 347 was 2 corridors down. She could hear them before she saw them. His O2 is dropping. A monitor beeping its steady decline. 78, 75. The tension pneumothorax had progressed exactly as it would. The colonel's lung had collapsed under pressure, building up air in the space between lung and chest wall, crushing everything toward his heart. The monitors told the story in numbers and alarm tones. The machines were screaming what the doctors couldn't seem to process. 5 doctors stood around the bed like pallbearers at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Dr. Hargrove occupied the space closest to the ventilator, his hand on the colonel's chart like possession was negotiable. 2 cardiac specialists flanked him. Behind them, a trauma surgeon and a pulmonologist, both summoned at 1:27 a.m. with the promise of consultation fees that would pad their accounts considerably. None of them were touching the patient. We need imaging before we proceed with any intervention, Dr. Hargrove was saying, his voice carrying the particular certainty of a man who'd never spent more than 3 minutes deciding whether someone lived or died. A chest X-ray. A CT if we have time. We don't have time, the pulmonologist said. But he didn't move. He was a man in his 60s, careful with liability, careful with his credentials. His saturation is dropping. But without confirmation of the diagnosis. We confirm it by needle decompression, Rachel said quietly. The room didn't just stop talking. It stopped breathing. Even the machine seemed to pause. 5 sets of eyes turned toward her. Hargrove's expression moved through surprise and into something darker. Recognition. Not of who she was, but of what he'd just sensed, a threat to his control of the room. Your temp agency, he said flatly. Not a question. A dismissal. 72 saturation, Rachel said, stepping toward the bed. His trachea's shifting. You can see the subcutaneous emphysema in his neck right now. You don't need a CT. You need a 14-gauge catheter in the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and about 30 seconds. The protocol requires, one of the cardiac specialists started. The protocol requires keeping him alive, Rachel interrupted. Her voice had dropped something. It wasn't aggressive. It was the voice of someone who'd made this exact decision while rounds of fire turned the air into geometry. 70 saturation. That's 4 minutes until cardiac arrest. How long for your imaging? The trauma surgeon, the only one with actual battlefield experience, Rachel could tell by the way his hands moved, made a small sound. Acknowledgement. He knew. They all knew. But knowing and acting were countries separated by the ocean of institutional liability and professional caution. "I'm not comfortable," Hargrove said, with an unlicensed. "I'm a registered nurse," Rachel said. She wasn't technically. Not anymore. But the words came out as statement of fact, not request. "And your patient is dying. 68 saturation." The monitor beeped its confirmation. One long tone. The colonel's heart rate had spiked to 142, his body in revolt against the oxygen debt that was becoming existential. "Step back," Rachel said to the 5 doctors. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed by people with considerably more authority than they possessed. The mask was slipping. The temp nurse was disappearing. Something else was emerging. One of the doctors actually moved. The trauma surgeon. He shifted sideways, clearing the space. His eyes had narrowed. He'd heard something in her voice. Something that didn't match scrubs and a hospital ID. Hargrove didn't move. "Absolutely not. I'm calling security. This is completely inappropriate." Rachel's hands were already moving. Muscle memory. 37 deployments worth of muscle memory. She'd done this 43 times in Baghdad, twice in Kandahar, once in the back of a Humvee while the transmission was shot out by small arms fire. Her hands knew the angle. The depth. The speed. She produced the 14-gauge catheter from the crash cart without looking for it. Just knew where it would be because crash carts were identical across the military medical system and private hospitals didn't matter when it came to the physics of dying. Antiseptic. The smell of betadine was the same everywhere. Copper underneath it. The colonel's skin, already in the early stages of shock. She swabbed the site between his ribs, second space, mid-clavicular line, her hand steady as a laser that had been calibrated by 1,000 decisions made under fire. 51 seconds, she said softly. "That's how long you've got." The needle went in at the precise angle. Her left hand braced against his chest. Her right drove through skin and muscle and the tough intercostal membrane with the kind of certainty that only comes from having done something 100 times before the moment it counted. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound in the world. Pressurized, trapped air rushed out with an audible release. The tension pneumothorax venting. The pressure that had been crushing the colonel's lung releasing into the atmosphere like a breath held for too long finally exhaled. The monitors didn't lie. 75 saturation. 82. 88. 92. Stable. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their constant frequency. None of the 5 doctors moved. The trauma surgeon had moved further back, giving her space. Giving her authority. His hands were at his sides, perfectly still, the posture of someone watching a master class they hadn't expected to witness. Hargrove's mouth was open. His hand was still on the chart. The liability was gone now. Responsibility was already shifting. If the patient coded, there would be a question now. If the patient lived, there would be a different question. Both questions would eventually lead to her. "Get me a chest tube kit," Rachel said, not looking at any of them. Her voice had gone quiet. Clinical. The voice of someone who'd stopped being a temporary anything. "And call radiology for a portable chest X-ray to confirm lung re-expansion." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and every person in that room understood the distinction. The pulmonologist moved first. Then the cardiac specialists. Even Hargrove, his face the color of something processing information it wasn't equipped to understand, stepped toward the supply cabinet. The colonel's oxygen saturation climbed to 94. Stable. Alive. Rachel stood over the bed, her hand still resting on his chest, feeling the cardiac rhythm stabilize beneath her palm. His heart was strong. It always had been. In Baghdad, it had kept pumping through the worst trauma she'd ever seen a human survive. Now, At 2:51 a.m. in a private hospital room in Norfolk, Virginia, it continued that same stubborn refusal to stop. The Colonel's eyes opened. Unfocused. Sedated. But open. Alive. And Rachel realized, in that moment while the 5 doctors scrambled to do what she'd already done, that she'd just exposed herself completely. There was no invisible anymore. There was no temp nurse anymore. There was just what she could do, and what everyone in this room now understood she'd been trained to do. She'd saved him once in the sand while bullets turned buildings into dust. She'd saved him again in fluorescent light while 5 doctors watched someone they'd dismissed perform a procedure they wouldn't attempt. The silence was so thick it had weight. The monitors still showed what they showed. Sinus rhythm. O2 sat climbing toward 90. The room held its breath like a held exhale that might shatter if anyone moved wrong. Rachel's hands were steady. They always were. The 14-gauge catheter had done exactly what field medicine taught it to do, what Baghdad had taught her, under fire, with mortars walking their way down a street lined with rubble. 217 times she'd performed variations of this procedure. This was 218. The rush of trapped air had escaped like a sigh. The Colonel's oxygen rose. 84. 87. 91. Dr. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. She stepped back from the bed. Removed her gloves. Turned toward the door with the same unhurried precision she'd learned in a world where speed and composure were not the same thing. The family was staring. The 4 consulting physicians, the ones he'd called in for the billable consultations, were staring. One of them had his mouth open. None of them had moved when the Colonel went into arrest. None of them had stepped forward when 5 doctors stood in a room and one of them refused to act. Rachel didn't look back. She was in the break room pulling off her name badge when the overhead speaker crackled. Dr. Hargrove to administration. Dr. Hargrove to administration, immediately. 3 minutes later, security was walking toward her locker. The officer's name was Marcus. She'd seen him every shift for 3 months. He'd held the ER door open once when her hands were full. His expression now was the expression of someone following orders that made his jaw tight. Rachel Torres? His voice asked permission from a script. Yes. I need to escort you from the building. You have 5 minutes to clear your locker. The termination letter was printed on hospital letterhead. Her hands were steady as she read it. Violation of protocol. Performing procedures outside scope of practice. Endangering patient safety through unauthorized interventions. The words were shaped like weapons made of regulations. She'd seen worse aimed at her in military tribunals. She'd seen discharge papers that erased her name from every database the Pentagon maintained. She'd seen classified stamps and witness statements claiming she'd never existed at all. This was just a different kind of erasure. The locker door opened to the smell of the small space she'd occupied for 90 days. 2 clean scrubs hung on hooks. A water bottle. Her phone charger. A pair of compression socks still in their package. And there, in the corner where she'd placed it on day 1, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, the faded Air Force unit patch. The one the Colonel had sewn into his jacket lining in Baghdad 15 years ago with her callsign stitched beneath it in careful, precise thread. Ghostbird. The name he'd whispered when she pulled him 3 blocks through sniper fire with his leg torn open and his lung collapsing. She picked it up. The fabric was thin now. The stitching had faded from black to something the color of old iron. She turned it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, which was to say, almost nothing. A piece of cloth. A memory. Proof of a ghost. She put it in the cardboard box Marcus handed her. Added the cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. Added the small ceramic pot with the succulent that was more brown than green now, dying from her neglect across 1,000 night shifts. Added the photograph of her SEAL team from Coronado, 2009. 12 faces. 4 of them were crossed out in her own hand with a permanent marker, the ones who hadn't come home from the operation that had made her officially non-existent. The walk to the ER exit took 43 seconds. She counted them without thinking. Marcus didn't speak. That was respect, in its own way. The kind of respect that meant he wasn't going to pretend this wasn't wrong. He just held the door open like he had before, and she walked out into the Norfolk night. The rain started before she reached the bus stop. It came down in sheets, the kind of rain that made the streetlights blur like watercolor paintings of themselves. She sat on the bench at the corner of West Butte and Boat Tut, the cardboard box in her lap, and watched the city pretend to sleep around her. The rain soaked through her jacket. The temperature had dropped to 41 degrees. She'd worked a 14-hour shift. She'd just lost the job that was supposed to let her hide in plain sight. The bench was wet. She sat on it anyway. Her phone had no messages. No missed calls. The temp agency had sent an automated email at 11:41 p.m., standard termination notice, no cause listed, no recourse mentioned. She'd scrolled through her contacts at 1:06 a.m., looking at names she couldn't call. Her former commanding officer, dead since 2018. The SEAL she'd trained with, unreachable in a black site she couldn't acknowledge. Her sister, who thought she'd died in a car accident in 2008, which was what the military had told her to say. She was $23 short of a motel room. The rain hit harder. It sounded like applause against the plastic shelter of the bus stop. She held the cardboard box and thought about the colonel lying in room 347, his oxygen sat stable now, his chest rising and falling on rhythm that was his own again. She thought about the four specialist physicians who had refused to attempt the procedure. She thought about Dr. Hargrove's face when he understood what had just happened, that he'd watched a temp nurse with no credentials and invisible rank perform the exact action 5 licensed doctors would not. Maybe they were right. Maybe she should have stayed invisible. She opened the box. The unit patch was on top. She held it in both hands, rain dripping off the edges, and looked at the stitching. Ghostbird. The name they'd given her because she flew into impossible situations and came back like she'd never been there at all. The name that was supposed to stay classified. The name that was buried under 17 layers of false identity and federal secrecy. She thought about throwing it away. The bus would come in 43 minutes. She could throw it in the rain, let it soak and dissolve into the Norfolk pavement, one less thing to carry, one less ghost. She could walk into a shelter. She could drive her 2004 Civic to the Virginia border and start again under a name that had no history, no scars, no tattooed reminders on the forearms of men she'd saved. Her hands shook. But soldiers don't cry. Her eyes burned, but soldiers don't cry. She pressed the patch against her chest, feeling it soak through her jacket, and closed her eyes. The sound came first as a distant pulse. Like a heartbeat in the sky. Like something mechanical and impossible and alive. The rotor wash hit the oak trees across the street, sending leaves spiraling down in patterns like weather systems on the move. The sound grew from a pulse to a presence. She opened her eyes and looked up. The Blackhawk helicopter descended through the rain like something summoned from the absolute inside of military protocol. Its lights cut through the dark in methodical sweeps. The rotor wash became a wind. The wind became a force that bent the oak branches vertical. The helicopter was 50 meters away. 100 meters from the hospital. Coming down exactly where the colonel was fighting to survive. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then more. The sound of military movement didn't need equipment, it sounded like purpose. Rachel sat motionless on the wet bench, cardboard box in her lap, the faded unit patch still pressed against her chest. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the bus stop once, twice, then held steady. She did not move. She did not look away. The light held on her for exactly 5 seconds. Long enough to acknowledge. Long enough to confirm. Then it swept back toward the hospital, where men in dress uniforms were already walking toward room 347, carrying with them every file that had been classified about Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the files that said she was dead, or missing, or had never existed at all. The rain kept falling. The helicopter kept descending. The night kept holding its breath. And somewhere inside Oak Creek Memorial, in a room where a colonel had survived sniper fire and roadside bombs and 15 years of living with a ghost's name sewn into his jacket, the classified files were about to arrive. The men in dress uniforms were about to walk through the door. The truth was about to become impossible to deny. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a physical force, scattering rain sideways across the asphalt. The Blackhawk descended through Norfolk fog at 6 o'clock, its nose tilted forward, running lights cutting through the grey. 2 Navy officers in dress blue stood waiting at the entrance, dress uniforms immaculate, covers squared away, the kind of bearing that made hospital security instinctively straighten their spines. The pilot cut the engines and the rotors wound down with a descending whine that sounded like a massive turbine exhaling its last breath. The lead officer walked through the automatic doors without hesitation. His name was Commander Mitchell, Special Operations Liaison. He carried a folder stamped declassified and a mandate that transcended hospital hierarchy. His eyes swept the lobby, badge clipped to his belt, side-arm visible, the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. Callsign Ghostbird." His voice carried no question mark. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Security hesitated. The night shift supervisor at the desk looked up, confused. Nobody in this hospital went by that name. A temp nurse named Rachel had been escorted out 8 hours ago, terminated for cause, but a senior chief. A call sign? The supervisor's radio crackled with uncertainty. That was when the second officer stepped forward. She wore the single gold bar of a Navy lieutenant, her name tape reading Torres Michaels. Her eyes were storm gray, the exact same shade as the woman who'd checked her father's vitals 2 hours before she was fired. "My father survived Baghdad because of Senior Chief Torres." Her voice didn't waver. "He was medevaced with a traumatic brain injury. 2 blocks under sniper fire. She carried him out." The lieutenant paused, then added quietly, "He still doesn't remember her face." "But I do. She saved his life twice in one night." The security guard's face shifted. Recognition flickered. He reached for his desk phone, but before he could dial, a floor nurse, the same one who'd witnessed Hargrove's public humiliation of Rachel just hours before, appeared in the hallway, walking toward them on instinct. She'd been making morning rounds when she heard the helicopter land. Her hands trembled as Commander Mitchell extended the declassified file. "Read it aloud," he said. The nurse's fingers shook as she opened the folder. The paper was yellowed, edges worn from years in a vault. Her voice cracked on the first line. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Marie Torres. Classification Level, TSSCI, Tour 1, Fallujah. Tour 2, Sanjin Valley. Tour 3, Baghdad District." She turned the page, her breath catching. "Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Bronze Star." Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Then, 2 purple hearts. Her eyes glistened. For wounds sustained while extracting personnel under direct fire. A third figure emerged from the crowd of mourning staff, a man in civilian clothes, but his posture screamed military. 6'3", shoulders wide as a doorway, with a scar that ran from temple to jaw. A SEAL team leader, retired now but carrying the weight of every mission. He stepped forward and finished what the nurse could not voice. His words came calm and precise, the way operators speak when every word matters. Navy Cross for extracting 12 wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire, including Colonel James Michaels, callsign Sandman. She extracted him twice in one night. Once from the initial blast site. Once from a secondary ambush. He let that land. That medal doesn't exist in any system. They buried the records because the operation was classified above top secret. But it happened. I was there. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the hallway behind the SEAL leader, drawn by voices and the unmistakable sound of authority reshaping the air pressure around him. His face drained from red to ash in the span of 2 seconds. His mouth opened. His hands lifted. The sounds that came were not words, they were air escaping, like a balloon losing pressure, like a man who'd just realized his entire position was built on sand and the tide was coming in. He tried. "I can explain." Commander Mitchell didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge him. Simply turned to the security guard who'd escorted Rachel out 8 hours prior and extended a cardboard box. Not Rachel's box. A new one. Identical in every detail. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." The guard accepted the box and held it toward Hargrove with perfect composure. The message was understood. The same treatment. The same descent. Security appeared, moving with the fluid efficiency of personnel trained for exactly this scenario. Hargrove's voice cracked as they guided him toward the exit. "You don't understand what she is. What she's capable." "We know exactly what she's capable of," the SEAL leader said quietly. "We're the ones who trained her." The escort completed. The parking lot swallowed Hargrove's protests. The folder closed. The meeting had taken 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 6 months later, Rachel Torres ran the military liaison program at Oak Creek Memorial. Her office was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the new trauma bay that the hospital board had funded after federal investigators concluded their review of Dr. Hargrove's billing practices. $2 million in fraudulent claims. $2 million that should have gone to patient care instead of Hargrove's personal accounts and his attorney brother-in-law's real estate portfolio. The framed patch hung on her office wall, faded now, the stitching loose from 15 years of being carried inside a jacket lining. An Air Force unit patch. And beneath it, in careful handwriting that only she could see unless you stood directly in front of the frame, 2 words, Ghostbird. Colonel Michaels had sewn that patch in 2009. Had carried it for 15 years as proof. As anchor. As the thing that kept him tethered to the woman he couldn't remember but whose name was tattooed on his forearm in letters that would fade but never disappear, Rachel. Dr. Hargrove sold supplemental insurance policies now. From a folding table outside a strip mall urgent care clinic in Tucson, Arizona. His name tag read Steve. He didn't use his former credentials. He wouldn't be allowed to. His medical license had been revoked. His malpractice settlements had cost him everything: the house in Norfolk, the vacation property in Cabo, the vintage motorcycle he'd financed with kickback money. When patients came to the clinic asking if the insurance guy had any medical training, if there was a doctor on staff, Steve flinched. Every single time. Because somewhere in Tucson, a nurse named Torres was making decisions that changed lives. And somewhere in Norfolk, at a hospital called Oak Creek Memorial, people whispered about the temp nurse who'd carried 12 wounded soldiers out of a burning building in Baghdad. Who'd saved her commanding officer twice in 6 hours. Who'd been erased by the Pentagon and hidden by necessity, only to be brought home by a Blackhawk landing at dawn. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The years Rachel had spent underground, watching Hargrove build his empire on fraud, on the backs of military veterans too traumatized to scrutinize their own bills. She could have exposed him at any moment. Instead, she'd waited. She'd let the system work. And when it mattered, when a man's life hung on a single procedure that 5 doctors refused to authorize, she'd made the choice that mattered. Scars tell stories. Some written in flesh. Some written in hand-stitched call signs on Air Force patches that take 15 years to speak their truth. Tell me something: if you'd been standing in that Norfolk hospital at 6 o'clock when the Blackhawk landed, would you have been able to see what was really happening? Would you have understood what it means to carry someone's ghost for 15 years, waiting for the moment you could finally bring them home? Subscribe and let me know if you believe some secrets are worth keeping, and some are worth the entire weight of the truth when they finally break free.